We heard the stories of victims. We heard the accounts that had been buried for years, hidden behind closed doors, locked away in the silence of fear and uncertainty. And honestly, we heard the story of at least one person who had never come forward before that day. This was the very first time, the absolute first moment that she was telling anyone, in a semi-public way, what she had witnessed. The trembling in her voice as she sat in that witness chair, the way her hands clutched the edge of the wooden stand until her knuckles went white, the tears she fought back with every single word she forced herself to speak. And in that courtroom, time seemed to freeze, every breath held, every eye fixed forward. When Victoria Sterling, the First Lady of the United States, filed a defamation lawsuit against Congresswoman Denise Crawford, nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, expected the trial to escalate into a national reckoning. Nobody anticipated that a single moment in that Phoenix, Arizona courthouse would change everything. Nobody predicted that 10 seconds of testimony would crack open a case that was supposed to be airtight, a case that the most expensive lawyers in the country had assured the First Lady was unwinnable by the other side. Before we go deeper into this story, take a second and hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like, and let us know where you're watching from. I'm curious to know how far these stories travel. The morning the headline broke across every news network in America, it was as if the very ground shook beneath Washington's feet. You have to understand something, this had never happened before. Not like this. For the first time in modern American history, a sitting First Lady had decided to take a rising political star to court, not over policy disagreements or partisan battles, not over budget allocations or foreign policy disputes. No, this was something far more personal. This was about words. Specifically, words that Congresswoman Denise Crawford had spoken on a nationally televised cable news program just 3 weeks earlier. According to Victoria's legal team, those words hadn't just been controversial, they had crossed a line. A legal line. A bright, unmistakable line that separated protected political speech from outright defamation. And now, in a courtroom packed with reporters, attorneys, camera crews, curious onlookers, and spectators who had lined up at 4 a.m. just to get a seat, the First Lady was demanding accountability. She was demanding justice. She was demanding that Congresswoman Crawford answer for what she had said. Think about that for a moment. Let it really sink in. A First Lady, traditionally a figure who stays above the political fray, who focuses on ceremonial duties, charitable causes, and the graceful representation of American values abroad, had stepped into the arena. She had traded her carefully maintained silence for the chaos of a public courtroom. She had filed a lawsuit. She had hired a team of the most expensive and aggressive attorneys money could buy. And she had publicly declared war on a congresswoman who had built her entire career on one foundational principle: speaking truth to power, no matter the consequences. Outside the Maricopa County Superior Courthouse in Phoenix that first morning, the scene was nothing short of chaotic. It looked like something out of a movie, except it was real, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Protesters lined both sides of Central Avenue, their signs held high against the bright Arizona sun, their voices echoing through the morning air until they blended into a single, indistinguishable roar. On one side stood supporters of the First Lady, many of them dressed in their Sunday best despite it being a Tuesday morning, holding professionally printed signs that read, "Protect our First Lady and truth matters, and defamation is not free speech." Many wore buttons featuring Victoria Sterling's image, her composed face a symbol of what they saw as grace under unfair attack. On the other side stood Congresswoman Crawford's supporters, a more diverse crowd, visibly younger, noticeably louder, wearing T-shirts with Crawford's face emblazoned across them beneath slogans like, "Speak truth to power," and carrying hand-painted signs that declared, "Free speech is not a crime, and you can't. Silence the truth," and "Money can't buy silence." Several of them had traveled from Crawford's home district in Michigan, taking time off work, pooling their resources, making the long drive across the country to show their support for the woman who had represented them in Congress. The media had descended on Phoenix like locusts, discovering a fresh field. Satellite trucks lined every available parking space within a 3-block radius, their telescoping antennas reaching toward the cloudless blue sky. Reporters from every major network and quite a few minor ones jockeyed for position on the courthouse steps, their camera operators pushing and shoving for the best angle, their producers screaming instructions into their earpieces. Print journalists clutched their notebooks and digital recorders. Podcasters spoke into portable microphones. Citizen journalists live-streamed from their phones. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a cultural moment. This was a battlefield in America's never-ending war over truth, power, and who gets to define reality. And absolutely everyone knew it. Inside the courthouse, past the metal detectors and the security checkpoints and the marshals checking credentials, the tension was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. The air conditioning hummed overhead at full blast, but it did precious little to cool the heated atmosphere. Every seat in the gallery was filled. People stood shoulder to shoulder along the back wall, craning their necks, straining to see the proceedings. Marshals moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, keeping order, their eyes constantly scanning for any sign of trouble, any disruption that might derail what promised to be the most watched trial in recent memory. At the plaintiff's table sat Victoria Sterling, herself elegant, composed, every hair in place, her designer suit impeccable in its cut and color, her posture perfect, as if she were posing for a portrait rather than sitting in a courtroom. She stared straight ahead, her face betraying nothing, her emotions locked away behind a mask that she had spent years learning to perfect. Whatever she was feeling, fear, anger, determination, doubt, none of it showed. She was, as always, the picture of controlled grace. Beside her sat her lead attorney, Marcus Hamilton, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. Hamilton had never lost a defamation case in his entire career, not once in 23 years of practice. He was known in legal circles as the executioner, a man who dismantled opposing counsel with surgical precision, who picked apart witness testimony until nothing remained but rubble, who left nothing but wreckage in his wake. He had represented celebrities, corporations, politicians, and billionaires. His hourly rate was rumored to be in the thousands, and he had assured Victoria Sterling, in no uncertain terms, that this case was a slam dunk. At the defense table sat Congresswoman Denise Crawford, and if Victoria Sterling was ice beautiful, perfect, and cold, Denise Crawford was fire. She leaned back in her chair with a casualness that bordered on defiance, one arm draped over the back, her eyes fixed on the First Lady with an intensity that made onlookers uncomfortable. Crawford had dressed simply for court, a navy blue blazer over a crisp white blouse, modest gold earrings, her natural hair pulled back into a neat bun that she wore like a crown. There was no pretense about her, no performance, no carefully constructed image, just raw, unapologetic presence that seemed to fill whatever space she occupied. Beside her sat her attorney, Patricia Okonkwo, a former public defender turned civil rights lawyer who had made her name defending activists, whistleblowers, and ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances. Okonkwo was the polar opposite of Hamilton in almost every conceivable way. Where he was cold and calculating, she was warm and passionate. Where he relied on precedent and procedure and the precise letter of the law, she appealed to conscience and common sense and the spirit of justice. Where he intimidated witnesses, she won them over. Their opposing styles promised a legal battle for the ages. As the bailiff called the court to order and Judge Raymond Chen took his seat behind the elevated bench, every person in that room, from the high-powered attorneys to the sketch artists to the spectators in the back row, understood that what was about to unfold would transcend the legal questions at hand. This wasn't just about defamation law and its arcane requirements. This wasn't just about protected speech versus malicious falsehood. This wasn't just about two women with a grievance. This was about power. This was about truth. This was about who gets to define reality in America. And the nation, every single corner of it, from Portland to Miami, from Dallas to Detroit, was watching. To understand what brought Victoria Sterling and Denise Crawford to this moment sitting on opposite sides of a courtroom, their futures hanging in the balance, you have to understand who these women truly were. You have to understand the journeys that had shaped them, the worlds that had formed them, the experiences that had made them into the people now locked in this very public battle. Victoria Sterling had come to America as a young woman, with dreams of success and a face that could launch 1,000 magazine covers. Born in a small village in Eastern Europe, she had grown up in modest circumstances, the daughter of a factory worker and a seamstress. But from an early age, it was clear that Victoria was destined for something more. She was beautiful in a way that transcended culture and language. High cheekbones, striking eyes, a statuesque figure that photographers couldn't help but notice. By 16, she was working as a model in local advertisements. By 18, she had moved to Paris. By 20, she was appearing in fashion magazines across Europe. The move to America had been strategic. Her agent had told her that the real money, the real fame, the real opportunity was in New York. And so she had packed her bags, said goodbye to her family, and stepped off a plane at JFK with nothing but a suitcase full of clothes and a determination that bordered on ferocious. She had worked her way through the industry, navigating its pitfalls and predators, building a portfolio, making connections, climbing the ladder one rung at a time. And then, at a party in Miami during Art Basel, she had met Harrison Sterling. Harrison Sterling was already a legend by then. A billionaire real estate developer whose golden name adorned skyscrapers in a dozen major cities, whose face appeared regularly on the covers of business magazines, whose every move was chronicled by the tabloid press. He was brash, confident, impossible to ignore. And when he saw Victoria across that crowded room, something clicked. Their courtship was brief. Harrison was not a man known for patience. Their wedding was lavish, a spectacle covered by every media outlet in the country. And their marriage was, according to the tabloids at least, complicated in ways that only the marriages of the very rich can be. When Harrison Sterling announced his candidacy for president, Victoria became an asset. Her elegance, her poise, her carefully cultivated silence. She was the perfect political spouse, beautiful enough to generate positive coverage, supportive enough to stand by her husband at rallies and debates, and quiet enough that she never generated controversy of her own. She smiled for the cameras, waved at the crowds, and said almost nothing of substance. For years, that strategy had worked perfectly. The press couldn't attack what she never said. Her favorability ratings remained remarkably high, even as her husband's fluctuated wildly. She had mastered the art of being seen without being heard. But silence, as it turns out, has its limits. And some truths are simply too powerful to remain hidden forever. Denise Crawford had taken a very different path to power. Raised in a working-class neighborhood on the east side of Detroit, Michigan, she had grown up in a world that was light years away from Paris runways and Miami penthouses. Her mother had worked 2 jobs days at a grocery store, nights cleaning office buildings, just to keep the lights on and food on the table. Her father had struggled with unemployment for years after the plant where he worked shut down and moved its operations overseas. Her older brother Marcus had gotten caught up in the criminal justice system as a teenager, a story she would later describe as watching the American dream slip through someone's fingers, no matter how hard they reached for it. That experience had forged her. It had taken whatever softness she might have had and hammered it into steel. Crawford had been a brilliant student, but college had seemed financially impossible until a scholarship from a local civic organization changed everything. She had worked her way through the University of Michigan on that scholarship and a series of part-time jobs, waitressing, tutoring, working the front desk at a law firm that would later hire her as a paralegal. She had earned her law degree at night while working full-time during the day, surviving on coffee and determination, graduating near the top of her class despite having done everything the hard way. She had started her career as a public defender, fighting for clients who couldn't afford representation, standing up for people the system had already written off. She had seen how the criminal justice system treated the poor and the marginalized. She had watched innocent people get crushed by machinery that was supposed to protect them. And she had decided that if she wanted to change things, really change things, she needed to be where the decisions were made. When she decided to run for Congress, everyone told her it was impossible. She had no corporate backing. She had no family money. She had no political connections. Her opponent was a 3-term incumbent who had the support of every major interest group in the district. The smart money said she didn't have a chance. She won anyway, by 4 points, on a wave of grassroots enthusiasm that nobody had seen coming. In Congress, Crockett had quickly made a name for herself as someone who wasn't afraid to ask the questions no one else would ask. During committee hearings, she grilled witnesses who tried to evade her, cutting through their prepared talking points with follow-up questions that left them stammering. She called out corruption wherever she found it, regardless of which party the corrupt official belonged to. She became known for her sharp tongue, her quick wit, her encyclopedic knowledge of policy details, and her absolute refusal to back down from a fight. If you were in Victoria Sterling's shoes right now, fighting to protect your reputation against a political opponent who had made her career on exactly this kind of confrontation, what would you do? Would you stay silent and hope it blows over, or would you fight back with everything you have? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And that fearlessness was precisely what had gotten her into trouble. 3 weeks before the trial began, Crockett had appeared on The Evening Hour, a nationally televised cable news program watched by millions. The topic of discussion was government spending, specifically certain defense and infrastructure contracts that had been awarded to companies with reported ties to the Sterling administration. The host had asked Crockett directly about the First Lady's rumored involvement in these dealings. And Crockett, being Crockett, had answered honestly. She had said, and these were her exact words captured on video for all the world to see, that Victoria Sterling was not the innocent bystander her handlers want us to believe she is. She had suggested that the First Lady had been directly involved in behind-the-scenes negotiations that had benefited certain business interests. She had called for a congressional investigation into what she termed the First Lady's shadow influence. And she had concluded by saying that the American people deserve to know the truth about who is really first making decisions in this administration. Within hours, those words had gone viral. Within days, they had become the subject of endless cable news debates, with commentators from both sides of the political spectrum weighing in on whether Crockett had gone too far. And, within 2 weeks, Victoria Sterling's attorneys had filed a defamation lawsuit in Maricopa County Superior Court, seeking $50 million in damages. $50 million. That number alone told you everything you needed to know about how seriously the First Lady's team was taking this. The lawsuit alleged that Crockett's statements were false, malicious, and had caused severe damage to the First Lady's carefully cultivated reputation. It claimed that Crockett had acted with actual malice, the legal standard requiring proof that she had either known her statements were false when she made them, or had shown reckless disregard for the truth. And it demanded not just monetary compensation that would bankrupt most people, but a public retraction and apology that would humiliate Crockett before the very same audience she had addressed. Crockett's response had been characteristically defiant. In a press conference held on the steps of the Capitol building, surrounded by supporters and fellow lawmakers who had flown in just to stand beside her, she had declared that she would not apologize for telling the truth. She had said that the lawsuit was nothing more than an attempt to silence a critic, to send a message to anyone who dared question the powerful. And she had promised to fight in court and in the court of public opinion until the very end. The legal battle lines were drawn in the sand, and there was no going back. The first week of the trial played out like a carefully choreographed dance, each side testing the other, probing for weaknesses, laying the groundwork for arguments that would unfold in the days and weeks to come. Both sides called witnesses. Both sides introduced exhibits and evidence. Both sides scored points and suffered setbacks. But through it all, one thing became increasingly clear to anyone paying close attention. This case was going to come down to evidence, not rhetoric, not sympathy, evidence. Marcus Hamilton, the First Lady's legendary attorney, called a parade of character witnesses to the stand, friends who had known Victoria for decades, associates from her modeling days, charity executives who had worked with her on various philanthropic causes, former staff members who testified to her kindness and generosity. One by one, they painted a picture of a woman who had been unfairly maligned, whose only crime was being married to a controversial figure, who had devoted countless hours to helping children, supporting veterans, and promoting cultural initiatives. The testimony was undeniably effective. Jurors nodded along as witness after witness described Victoria Sterling's dedication to charitable work. Several seemed genuinely moved by the stories of children's hospitals visited at odd hours, of disaster relief efforts organized with military precision, of scholarships funded for first-generation college students. Victoria Sterling, as presented by her legal team, was practically a saint, a woman who had given so much to others and asked for nothing in return except to be left alone. But Patricia Okonkwo, Crawford's attorney, was not impressed. During cross-examination of each witness, she methodically dismantled their credibility with the precision of a surgeon. She pointed out that many of them had financial ties to the Sterling family investments in Sterling properties, contracts with Sterling companies, donations that flowed through Sterling-connected foundations. She highlighted inconsistencies in their testimonies, places where their sworn statements contradicted earlier interviews or public records. She asked probing questions about what they had actually witnessed versus what they had been told to say by the First Lady's extensive public relations apparatus. And with each cross-examination, cracks began to appear in the First Lady's carefully constructed image. Before we continue, take a second and share your thoughts so far on this story below. I read every single one. The second week brought documentary evidence into sharp focus. Hamilton introduced records showing the positive media coverage Victoria Sterling had received before Crawford's comments and the dramatically negative coverage that followed. He brought in expert witnesses, media analysts, and public relations professionals who testified to the damage such statements could cause to a public figure's reputation. He even introduced social media analytics, showing the spike in negative mentions, hostile hashtags, and critical comments about the First Lady that had occurred in the immediate aftermath of Crawford's television appearance. The numbers were compelling and hard to dispute. The hashtags that had trended number First Lady Secrets, number Shadow Influence, number What is Victoria Hiding, had reached millions of Americans. The memes that had spread across platforms painted Victoria Sterling in the most unflattering possible light. The op-eds that had been published in major newspapers questioned her integrity and motives. By any measurable standard, Crawford's words had undeniably hurt Victoria Sterling's public image. But once again, Okonkwo had a counter-strategy that cut to the heart of the matter. She reminded the jury that in a defamation case involving a public figure, and the First Lady was certainly a public figure, proving damage to reputation wasn't enough. The plaintiff also had to prove that the statements in question were actually false and that the defendant had made them with actual malice. And so far, despite all the character witnesses and media analytics, Hamilton hadn't directly addressed either of those crucial elements. He had shown that Victoria Sterling had been hurt. He hadn't shown that Denise Crawford had lied. The third week was when everything started to change. Crawford's defense team had been hinting throughout the proceedings that they had evidence to support the Congresswoman's claims. In their opening statement, they had promised revelations. In their cross-examinations, they had suggested that documents existed that would corroborate everything Crawford had said. They had mentioned witnesses. They had implied that before this trial was over, the truth would emerge from the shadows where it had been hiding. But until now, they hadn't shown their hand. That changed on Wednesday afternoon of the third week. Okonkwo called her first major witness, Dr. Samuel Morrison, a forensic accountant whose credentials were beyond impressive. Morrison had spent 30 years following the money in white-collar criminal cases. He had testified before Congress on multiple occasions. He had consulted for the FBI, the SEC, and the Department of Justice. He had literally written textbooks on forensic accounting that were used in law schools across the country. And he had spent the past 6 months, hired by Crawford's legal team, analyzing financial records related to certain government contracts awarded during the Sterling administration. His testimony was devastating. Morrison explained, in painstaking detail, that somehow managed to be both technically precise and accessible to laypeople, how certain contracts awarded during the Sterling administration had followed an unusual pattern. Companies with no previous government experience, some of them newly incorporated, just months before the contracts were awarded, had suddenly won multi-million-dollar deals. Payments had been structured in ways that obscured their ultimate recipients, routed through multiple subsidiary corporations and holding companies. And money had flowed through a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts that made tracking the final destination nearly impossible without specialized expertise. None of this directly implicated Victoria Sterling by name. Morrison was careful to note, repeatedly, that he couldn't prove any specific individual's involvement based solely on financial records. But his testimony established something crucial. There was substance behind Crawford's claims. She hadn't made accusations out of thin air. She hadn't invented controversy for political gain. She had been referring to real patterns of suspicious activity that any reasonable person might question. Hamilton objected constantly throughout Morrison's testimony. He argued that the evidence was irrelevant to the defamation claims at hand. He said it was prejudicial, designed to inflame the jury rather than address the legal questions before them. He insisted that it went beyond the scope of what should be allowed in a defamation trial. Judge Chen overruled most of his objections, but did instruct the jury to consider the evidence only as it related to Crawford's state of mind. When making her statements, whether she had a reasonable basis to believe what she said was true. Still, the damage to the plaintiff's case was done. The seed of doubt had been planted, and seeds have a way of growing. The following day brought another witness, who proved equally damaging to the First Lady's case. Jennifer Huang, a former White House staffer who had worked in the communications office during the first 2 years of the Sterling administration. Huang had been a mid-level employee, not a household name, but her access had given her a window into the inner workings of the White House that few outsiders ever glimpse. Under Okonkwo's careful questioning, Huang painted a picture of a First Lady who was far more involved in the administration's operations than her public image suggested. She described meetings, closed-door sessions in the residence that weren't on any official calendar in which Victoria Sterling had weighed in on everything from messaging strategy to personnel decisions. She recalled occasions when the First Lady had expressed strong preferences about specific contractors being considered for government work, preferences that were subsequently reflected in the final decisions. And she testified that, contrary to the official narrative of Victoria Sterling as a passive figure focused solely on traditional First Lady duties, she was very much a power player, operating behind the scenes. Hamilton's cross-examination of Huang was aggressive, arguably the most aggressive of the entire trial. He questioned her motives for coming forward. He pointed out that she had left the White House under less than ideal circumstances. She had been let go during a staff reorganization that she had publicly criticized. He suggested that she harbored a personal grudge against the First Lady, that she was using this trial as an opportunity for revenge. He noted inconsistencies between her testimony and earlier statements she had made to reporters. But Huang held firm under pressure. She acknowledged that she had been frustrated during her time at the White House. She admitted that her departure had been difficult and that she had felt unfairly treated. But she insisted, again and again, that her testimony was accurate. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here because she had been subpoenaed, because she had taken an oath to tell the truth, and because some truths were simply too important to remain hidden. By the end of the third week, the momentum had clearly shifted. What had started as a seemingly straightforward defamation case, a powerful plaintiff with unlimited resources, crushing a political opponent who had crossed a line, had become something far more complicated. The question was no longer simply whether Crawford's statements had damaged Sterling's reputation. The question had become whether those statements might actually be true. And that question hung over the courtroom like a storm cloud, waiting to break. Before we go deeper, I would love to hear your point of view. Tell me what part hit you the hardest in the story, and share your thoughts in the comments. The fourth week of the trial began with a surprise announcement that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Okonkwo stood and informed Judge Chen that the defense would be calling one final witness, someone whose testimony, she promised, would be directly relevant to the heart of this case. The name she announced sent a visible ripple through the spectators. Martin Calloway. For those unfamiliar with Washington's inner circles, the name might not have meant much. But for those who paid attention to the Sterling administration's inner workings, the journalists who covered the White House, the political operatives who tracked personnel moves, the lawyers who specialized in government ethics, Martin Calloway was a figure of considerable significance. He had served as a senior advisor to the administration during its first 3 years, one of the handful of people with direct access to the highest levels of decision-making. He had been present for countless meetings, privy to countless decisions, and according to rumors that had circulated for years in Washington's more exclusive bars and restaurants, increasingly uncomfortable with what he had witnessed. Calloway had left the administration quietly in the middle of the 3rd year, citing personal reasons in a brief statement that said almost nothing. He had retreated from public life entirely, refusing interview requests from every major news outlet, declining to write the tell-all book that publishers had surely offered for 7 figures, ignoring the talking heads who speculated endlessly about what he knew. For years, he had maintained complete silence. Until now. When Calloway took the stand that Monday morning, the courtroom fell absolutely silent. Even the sketch artists stopped drawing, their charcoal pencils hovering motionless over their pads. Every eye was fixed on this man, middle-aged, balding slightly, wearing a simple gray suit that could have come from any department store, who supposedly held secrets that could shake the foundations of power. Okonkwo began her questioning gently, establishing Calloway's credentials, his role in the administration, his access to the decision-makers at the highest levels. Calloway answered each question calmly, his voice steady and measured, his demeanor professional. He was clearly nervous. You could see it in the slight tremor of his hands, the way he kept clearing his throat, but he was also clearly determined. He had made a decision to be here, and he wasn't going to back down now. Then Okonkwo asked the question that changed everything. Mr. Calloway, during your time in the administration, did you ever personally witness Victoria Sterling, the First Lady, participating in discussions about government contracts? There was a pause that seemed to last an eternity. Calloway looked down at his hands, folded on the wooden rail in front of him. He took a deep breath, and then he looked up, directly at the jury, and answered, "Yes, I did." The courtroom erupted. Hamilton leaped to his feet so fast his chair nearly toppled, objecting strenuously. Spectators gasped and murmured. Reporters started typing furiously on their laptops and phones. Judge Chen banged his gavel repeatedly, his voice rising as he called for order. But Calloway wasn't finished. Once the commotion subsided enough for him to be heard, he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. I was present at multiple meetings where the First Lady expressed preferences about specific contractors. I witnessed her advocate, directly and unmistakably, for companies that were later awarded contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. And I saw documents, internal memos, and emails that showed she had been consulted on these decisions before they were finalized. She wasn't just informed after the fact. She was part of the process. In less than 10 seconds of substantive testimony, Martin Calloway had delivered words that directly corroborated everything Congresswoman Crawford had claimed. In 10 seconds, he had shattered the carefully constructed image of Victoria Sterling as a passive, apolitical figure who simply stood beside her husband and smiled. In 10 seconds, he had turned the entire trial on its head. Hamilton's objections were sustained in part Judge Chen struck some of Calloway's testimony about documents he couldn't personally produce as evidence, but the catastrophic damage to the plaintiff's case could not be undone. The jury had heard it. The media had heard it. The millions of Americans watching coverage of the trial had heard it. And no amount of legal maneuvering, no objection sustained, no instruction to disregard could unhear those words. During cross-examination, Hamilton did everything in his considerable arsenal to undermine Calloway's credibility. He was aggressive, sarcastic, relentless. He questioned Calloway's memory, suggesting that years had passed, and memories fade. He implied that Calloway had a grudge against the Sterling family, perhaps over his departure from the administration, perhaps over some personal slight that had never been made public. He pointed out that Calloway had no documents to support his claims, nothing tangible that the jury could hold in their hands. He even insinuated that Calloway might have been paid by political opponents, perhaps even by Crawford's campaign, to deliver this carefully timed testimony. But Calloway remained unshaken throughout the assault. He acknowledged that he had no documents in his possession. He explained carefully that he had been required to surrender all materials when he left the administration, as was standard procedure. He admitted that his departure had been difficult, and that he had felt conflicted for years about what he had witnessed. But he insisted, again and again, his voice never wavering, that he was telling the truth, that he had seen what he had seen, that his conscience had finally compelled him to speak after years of silence. When Hamilton suggested, with barely concealed contempt, that Calloway was motivated by a desire for revenge, Calloway's response was quiet but devastating in its simplicity. "I'm not here for revenge," he said, looking directly at the jury rather than at the attorney grilling him. "I'm here because for 3 years I stayed silent about things I knew were wrong. I watched people in positions of trust abuse their power. I watched public resources flow to private interests. I watched the public trust being betrayed, and I said nothing. I told myself it wasn't my place, that I was just doing my job, that someone else would speak up eventually, but no one did, and the weight of that silence became unbearable. I'm tired of staying silent. The truth matters more than my comfort, more than my safety, more than whatever consequences might come from being here today." The courtroom was absolutely still. Several jurors were visibly moved. One woman in the back row wiped her eyes. Even Hamilton seemed momentarily at a loss for words. His next question, dying on his lips as he shuffled papers that suddenly seemed irrelevant. If you were in Denise Crawford's position, knowing that speaking out could cost you everything, that powerful forces would try to destroy you, that your entire career and reputation hung in the balance, would you have had the courage to stand up? It's worth thinking about. Not everyone does, and that's what made her story so remarkable. When Calloway stepped down from the witness stand, walking slowly back through the gallery and out of the courtroom, everyone in that room understood that something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer just a defamation trial between two women with a legal dispute. This had become something much bigger, a reckoning with power, with truth, with the very nature of accountability in American public life. For Congresswoman Crawford, sitting at the defense table with her attorney beside her, it was vindication. Her face remained composed and professional. She was too experienced to show emotion that could be used against her. But there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She had taken an enormous risk by making those statements on television. She had known that the powerful would come for her, that they had the resources to bury her in legal fees, that they could make her life miserable for years. And now, finally, she had been proven right. For Victoria Sterling, the moment was devastating. She sat motionless at the plaintiff's table, her face a perfect mask of composure, but those who knew her well, and perhaps even those who didn't, could see the micro-expressions of someone whose carefully constructed world had just shifted beneath her feet. She had gambled everything on this lawsuit. She had stepped out of the shadows of silence. She had exposed herself to public scrutiny that she had spent years avoiding. And now, instead of clearing her name and destroying her accuser, she had inadvertently opened a door that could never be closed. The remaining days of the trial felt almost anticlimactic after Calloway's testimony. Both sides delivered their closing arguments, but the energy in the room had fundamentally changed. Everyone, the judge, the attorneys, the jury, the spectators, knew how this was going to end. Hamilton's closing was professional but noticeably subdued, lacking the fire and confidence that had characterized his earlier arguments. He reminded the jury of the legal standards for defamation, walking them through the elements they were supposed to consider. He argued that even if some of Crawford's claims had merit, others clearly did not, that she had gone beyond what the evidence supported. He asked the jury to consider the damage that had been done to an innocent woman's reputation. But his words seemed hollow, going through the motions of an argument that had already been lost in the minds of everyone listening. Okonkwo's closing was different. She didn't just argue the technical requirements of the law, she told a story. She spoke of the importance of free speech in a democracy, how the founders had enshrined it in the First Amendment because they understood that those in power would always try to silence their critics. She reminded the jury that throughout American history, truth-tellers had been attacked by the powerful, that whistleblowers had been persecuted, that those who spoke up had often paid a heavy price. And she argued that Denise Crawford was part of that proud tradition, a woman who had seen something wrong and had refused to stay silent, even when silence would have been easier, even when silence would have been safer. "The question before you," Okonkwo told the jury in her final words, "is not just whether my client made statements that upset the First Lady. The question is whether, in America, we still have the right to question our leaders, whether we still have the courage to speak truth to power, whether we still believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant for corruption and abuse. Your verdict will send a message far beyond this courtroom. Make it a message that America can be proud of." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, a remarkably short time for a case of this magnitude and complexity, a case that had consumed weeks of testimony and generated thousands of pages of evidence. When they returned to the courtroom, their faces somber. Their verdict was unanimous. Not liable on all counts. Denise Crawford had won. The reaction to the verdict was immediate and intense, spreading across the country like wildfire. Outside the courthouse, Crawford's supporters erupted in celebration, their cheers echoing off the buildings of downtown Phoenix. Chants of, "The truth won," and "You can't silence us," echoed through the streets. Reporters scrambled to get reaction quotes from anyone they could find. Social media exploded with commentary, analysis, and no small amount of pointed celebration from those who had supported the Congresswoman from the beginning. Victoria Sterling left the courthouse through a back entrance, surrounded by security, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses, her posture suggesting defeat despite her attempts to maintain dignity. She made no statement to the press. Her attorneys issued a brief press release, expressing disappointment with the verdict and promising to evaluate all options. But no appeal was ever filed. The First Lady retreated to the shadows once more, her silence restored, but this time it seemed less like strategy and more like survival. In the days and weeks that followed, the fallout continued to unfold. Calloway's testimony became the subject of intense media scrutiny and congressional interest. Investigative journalists from major newspapers and networks began digging into the contracts he had mentioned, filing Freedom of Information requests, interviewing former officials, following the money. Congressional committees announced that they would be holding hearings to look into the allegations. The story that Victoria Sterling had tried to suppress through litigation had instead been amplified beyond anything Crawford could have achieved on her own, a classic example of what lawyers call the Streisand effect. For Congresswoman Crawford, the victory was transformative. Her national profile soared overnight. Donations to her campaign and associated causes exploded. She became a sought-after speaker at events across the country, a symbol of resistance to those who believed that the powerful should be held accountable. In interviews after the trial, she was gracious but firm, refusing to gloat over her legal victory, but also refusing to apologize for anything she had said. "I didn't want to be in that courtroom," Crawford said in one interview that aired on national television. I would have preferred to focus on the work I was elected to do, fighting for working families, for healthcare access, for justice in our communities. But when someone with unlimited resources tries to silence you, tries to use the legal system as a weapon to crush dissent, you have to stand up. If I had backed down, it would have sent a message to every activist, every journalist, every concerned citizen that the powerful can destroy anyone who challenges them. I wasn't willing to send that message. The trial also sparked a broader national conversation about the relationship between wealth, power, and truth in American society. Commentators and scholars debated whether defamation law had become a tool for the wealthy to silence their critics, what some called strategic lawsuits against public participation. Legal experts analyzed the implications of the verdict for future cases, wondering if it might embolden other truth-tellers to speak up. And ordinary Americans watching from their living rooms, following along on their phones, discussing it around dinner tables and in break rooms, found themselves reflecting on what it means to speak truth in an age of spin and distortion. The witness who destroyed Victoria Sterling's case in 10 seconds, Martin Calloway, became a reluctant hero to many. He never sought the spotlight that followed. He never wrote a tell-all book despite the lucrative offers. He never went on a speaking tour or started a podcast or became a regular commentator on cable news. He gave exactly one follow-up interview, in which he explained simply that he had testified because it was the right thing to do, and sometimes that's all there is to it. Then he returned to private life, disappearing from public view as completely as he had before the trial. But his courage inspired others. In the months following the verdict, several other former administration officials came forward with their own accounts and observations. Investigations were launched at multiple levels of government. Stories that had been buried for years began to surface in major publications. The dam of silence that had held for so long began to crack, then crumble. None of this would have happened if one congresswoman from Detroit hadn't spoken up on television. None of this would have happened if one witness hadn't found the courage to tell the truth under oath. None of this would have happened if the system, flawed and imperfect as it undeniably is, hadn't ultimately worked the way it was supposed to. That's the lesson of this story, if there is one. Not that justice is automatic or guaranteed. Not that the good guys always win in the end. Life isn't a movie, and courtrooms aren't Hollywood sets. But when ordinary people find the courage to speak truth, when they refuse to be intimidated by power and wealth and the threat of legal destruction, when they stand up, even when the odds seem impossible and the costs seem unbearable, sometimes, just sometimes, truth prevails. And that's something worth remembering. That's something worth fighting for. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire story. It means the world to me that you're here, watching, listening, engaging with these stories that matter. If this one moved you, if it made you think, hit that like button and let me know. If you want to see more stories like this, stories about courage, about truth, about ordinary people standing up against extraordinary power, make sure you're subscribed to Real Tales. We're building something special here, a community of people who care about these stories, and I want you to be part of it. Drop a comment below and tell me, what do you think the real lesson of this trial was? Was it about free speech and the First Amendment? Was it about accountability for those in power? Was it about the courage it takes to tell the truth when staying silent would be so much easier? I read every single comment, and I'm genuinely curious to hear your take on what this story means to you. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and remember, the truth always finds a way. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes a witness willing to risk everything. But it finds a way. See you in the next one.